starting this video in the West Pacific, similar to what Eric did yesterday, but I'm less focused on the Australian heat wave. He did a great job covering that, but I'm looking at these trade winds, and they are weakening substantially in the West Pacific. Now, these trade winds, they're these easterlies blowing through the kind of equatorward areas of the globe here, right in the tropics. And they typically move east to west like this. And we track these all year. In winter, if those trade winds are very strong, we're worried about a La Nina. We kind of see it develop that way as it upwells cooler water in the eastern Pacific and kind of stretch that across the equator through the central Pacific. But when they're weak, it allows warm water, even some downwelling, to set up in the Pacific. And that's how you get these kind of surges of warming water. Then we're starting to talk about El Nino, right? The opposite of La Nina. And if you look at this area here, now, there's always a bit of a weakness in the trade winds here, just as you're kind of approaching what we call the South Pacific convergence zone here. But you'll notice that we've reversed those winds here over Indonesia, what we call the maritime continent, north of Australia here. They're certainly weak all in here. You can see they're blowing pretty quickly here through the central Pacific, but there's this large area of anomalous weakness, of really even westerlies. And what we're expecting here over the next 5, 10, 15 days is that this westerly wind burst, as we call it, and potentially a Kelvin wave, is going to continue to track west to east with longitude here out into the central Pacific, where that warming effect that I mentioned earlier, that tipping point toward El Nino, is likely to begin. And we're here in January. I think it's January 13th today. This is kind of, between maybe December and January is when we expect La Nina to peak or to reach that lowest kind of anomalous value in the central Pacific. And so we're kind of waiting for that tipping point, for things to turn the other way. I think this will be it. And it's certainly likely related to the heat wave that we've been experiencing in Australia. But if we look at the Hofmüller diagram, and I typically end the video on these, but really what we're looking at here, present day here on the 13th, there's that westerly wind burst right over here. Here's the longitude or the geography we're looking at, that trade wind weakness. And you can see today, it's here right over Indonesia, right? Just where we analyzed it on the Earth.Null School website, looking at those trade winds. But you'll notice over the next 15 days, this predictable track west-east rather quickly to the point by, next week into the third and final week of January thereafter, that westerly wind burst all the way out into the central Pacific. When I'd expect those ocean temperatures to respond pretty quickly after that, to the point where, this looks like the final nail into the coffin into the 2025-2026 La Nina. And it very likely could be the beginning of El Nino, that episode in 2026. Now, we typically don't see El Nino strengthen significantly through summer, but some of the forecasts have that. The ECMWF, those forecast plumes that we've shown you updated at the beginning of every month, shows that quick kind of arrival of El Nino potentially this year in spring into summer. That would be significant, not just for the globe, but certainly North American crop production going into the new cropping season here in 2026. So watching this closely over in the West Pacific, where so many of these stories start. That's why we start these videos often in that area here. And you'll notice that area, warmer here generally because of La Nina, which tends to be cooler east, warmer to the west by and large. But I'm looking at this is January 11th here, analyzed as of 2 days ago. And a lot of those analogs that Eric and I pulled up, not only last week, but the week before that, kind of looking at these La Ninas that strengthened into an El Nino. 2026 specifically, when you can kind of compare it to a lot of those analogs, in fact, almost all of them, has one of the weaker La Ninas here for early January. It's just this kind of remnant right here in the central Pacific. Sometimes you hear that called like a Madoki La Nina. Sometimes use that term kind of referred with El Nino, but really what I see here is warm water all around it. So warm water here. You even have warm water here over in the eastern Pacific. You have your kind of classic warm water north of Hawaii here, which is uncommon with La Nina. But this one seems to be on the outs here, and certainly as that westerly wind burst starts to move over the date line, further to the east, even there after that in late January, we're going to start to erode kind of the core of that La Nina signature, and would expect the departure of those conditions sometime maybe February. Kind of curiously, when I was analyzing the kind of position of the current MJO, so often when we're trying to identify, where is the MJO, we're looking for their thunderstorm activity. It's a convective, call it a circulation. It kind of behaves like one often. And so what I'm looking at here are essentially thunderstorm totals over the last 7 days. Now we're using infrared satellite as a kind of proxy for thunderstorm activity, but you can see all the thunderstorm activity that has occurred anomalously here over the last 7 days in here, kind of right over Indonesia, right over the kind of quote unquote maritime continent, as we call it. Now there's been all that tropical convection there. Its outflow is blowing to the south of that over the continent in the country of Australia, and they've just had very little cloud cover. That's essentially what this long wave radiation anomaly is telling us there's been a ton of cloud cover here. We're just going to assume, because it's over the tropics, that has been thunderstorms, and there has been a lack of it here over Australia, indicative of the last 7 days of the heat wave and the drier weather occurring there. Want to jump us back over to North America here this morning. As Eric mentioned yesterday, looking at that dominant ridge over the west, kind of centered over Northern California and Oregon, there's been some impacts as a result of that. You mentioned the possibility and the potential for that snowmelt. We'll have to keep an eye on that, given that this year started kind of, I would say, in a bizarre fashion, coming on late here in California, other parts of the west, but certainly starting slow just about for everybody else, including California for a time, and now seeing some kind of midwinter melt. And that's not necessarily what we want to see, but I don't think it's too aggressive yet to warrant that big of a concern. We have a lot to go in February and March, and we'll look at that forecast in a second here. Kind of elsewhere, looking at a little shortwave trough moving through the upper Midwest here this morning. I have a system associated with that. This little kind of weak cutoff low here, encountering some showers and precipitation across the southern U.S., but by and large, this is kind of that quiet pattern that I alluded to at the end of last week, where we're going to be a little bit quiet until this larger, broader trough. You can kind of see me drawing that there all the way almost from like Greenland over to British Columbia. As that further amplifies, this ridge is going to push further up into Canada. This trough is going to push further south, and we're going to see this kind of inclement weather typically associated with wintertime long wave troughs start to bleed into the eastern part of the country, and even the southeast too, at least with respect to temperatures and precipitation. I was kind of looking at the infrared satellite map here this morning, and boy, you can see that jet stream just funneling in as that very amplified ridge. I kind of mentioned the center of that somewhere here. We're seeing the jet stream flow predictably around that. It's kind of neat to see the high clouds just kind of literally like crashing in to the high plains and the front range here. Now, if you look at this, often in meteorology, we're looking, kind of to start out in the jet stream for the jet stream flowing around these ridges. It actually flows quicker, in part due to some quirks of the synoptic flow in the Coriolis parent force, but as that air is moving around the jet stream, it's actually moving quicker around the ridges in the atmosphere than it is around the base of these troughs. I kind of drew the base of that large trough just a second ago. And what that means is the air is flowing quicker here and it's flowing slower here, so it has to slow down. So that's why you see this like traffic jam. You see that traffic jam like in this area here where these clouds are almost like literally bunching up. Somewhere here over like Colorado, kind of getting stuck almost, if you will, kind of over Utah. And then flowing quicker again as they go back around the trough. And it's that phenomenon that produces convergence in the upper atmosphere. And the result of that is higher pressure down below at the surface. So like right under this crashing or coming together of that jet stream level winds is where you would expect generally a high pressure system. So when I went over this morning and looked at the official analysis here from the National Weather Service, there's that big dominant 1040 millibar high on the surface analysis. In fact, this high pressure kind of dominant all across the interior west, impacting some stagnant air advisories here over Oregon, and way to the north over Canada, much further away, is the kind of paired low, if you will. So kind of neat to see that, just looking at the infrared satellite in the morning. It's always something kind of neat you can put together just looking at that to start out your day. Looking over at the national radar here this morning, little system, little low pressure. We talked about that shortwave trough moving through the upper Midwest, seeing some showers as a result of that over Wisconsin and the Great Lakes here. That weak cutoff low, seeing some reflectivity, precipitation showers, and rainfall associated with that across southern and west central Texas here. And then just some light showers here across Montana here this morning. But by and large, relatively quiet, for mid-January. Don't see a big nor'easter. Don't see a big severe weather system moving through the south. Don't see a big atmospheric river impacting the western U.S. There's kind of a quieter week here until that trough amplifies further across the eastern U.S. Just these like little systems to keep an eye on right now. Now, as a result of that, the all hazards map from the National Weather Service, pretty quiet as well. Have some frost and cold weather advisories here across the southeast, close to the citrus belt. Those stagnant air advisories here over Oregon that I mentioned, even kind of getting up into southern Washington there, portions of the Snake River Valley and Idaho underneath that ridge and that associated high pressure. The air's just sitting here. It's kind of, you ever made a campfire and the smoke just kind of sits there at the ground and gets in everybody's face? It's kind of the analogy here I would use. So they're kind of worried about some of the pollution in these valleys just kind of sitting there with no ability to kind of mix it out given the prevailing weather pattern here. If you look further to the south, I think this is, those colors, it's hard to pair the difference between the two. I believe this is a dense fog advisory, as you can see. I guess that's a more like dolphiny gray versus this one's maybe more of like a, I don't know, like a soot gray. I'm kind of reaching for the difference here, but I'm guessing that's our Thule fog that's been settled in over California here. Mentioned those winter weather advisories across the upper Midwest, and then starting to see on the back side of that system the potential for a bit of lake effect snow. So you're seeing some of those advisories pop up there. But across the middle part of the country, high wind warnings here near the Golden Triangle of Montana, maybe a wind advisory here near the Black Hills, just up north of those, but pretty quiet just about everywhere else across the U.S. Look at the temperatures here this morning. I'm recording this about 6 a.m. Central Time. Those cold temperatures across the southeast, lingering cold weather, almost that like cold air damming on the lee side of the Appalachian showing up here with those freezing temperatures pretty far south, getting all the way down toward Tallahassee here, 30 degrees Fahrenheit this morning, and some cold air locked in here over the Intermountain West. But the warm-up is starting to really show up here even this morning across the high plains, the upper Midwest. We're going to see temperatures really spike here today. In fact, I'll jump over and show you those high temp forecasts from the National Weather Service. This is their NDFD, that's their National Digital Forecast Database. So putting together all the different National Weather Service high temp forecasts from today. That's why we put these charts together. But man, look at the warmth. January 13th, this is like, if I had to pick a day where I think the continental U.S. is going to be at its coldest, you're talking anywhere from like January 5th through the 15th is where we see these big cold air outbreaks, reach those crazy low temperatures. Like it's always during the playoffs, right? Some playoff game is being played with like negative 20 wind chills or something like that. And this is the opposite of that. You're seeing warmth almost across the board, save for like little sections of the southeast that I just mentioned. Now I take this forecast in tomorrow through Wednesday. We had that little low. Remember, you saw it moving through here. The backside of that, seeing temperatures come down and that warmth ahead of the low, pushing more off into New England, but warming up, still in the western kind of northern plains all the way over toward the continental divide. Very warm across the west as a result of that ridge that I mentioned. More of the same on Thursday, warm across the central, southern, and northern plains, cooler across the east and southeast, right, as that cold front continues to push toward the southeast. Now, these are maximum temperatures. In a little bit, I'll show you the minimum temperatures because those are going to be significant. Friday, still seeing kind of a brief warm-up come through the Midwest. We're staying warm out west. And Saturday, behind another one of these lows, seeing temperatures fall further. So while you're seeing me go through the forecast, you're seeing temperatures just kind of continuing to trend down here. And they're not trending up here, but they're certainly staying up. So we're seeing that trough amplify further, staying more over the west, and that trough exiting kind of this area and moving further and further toward the south. These kind of brief warm-ups and these brief cool-downs all throughout that period. This takes us all the way out to Monday of next week on the 19th. Much colder temperatures across a wide chunk of the eastern half of the country here. Now, as you can imagine, you're going to see that trough amplification pattern. Right now, I mentioned that this one is kind of that weak. I was trying to draw it from like British Columbia all the way over to Greenland here, but it's that weak kind of diffuse, hard to define long wave trough. But as I take this forecast for the 500 millibar heights through Wednesday, there's that system I was just talking about. Much more amplified ridge here over the western U.S. As you go through Wednesday into Thursday, deeper trough here, the eastern part of the country, kind of corridor or the trajectory of that trough was almost due north, straight south. I'll play that back quickly. See how it's going from like Manitoba, almost Ontario, straight down the spine here of the Mississippi. And that's not a good pathway or source region for moisture. You want to see these troughs kind of cut across this way, help surge that Gulf moisture back up into the U.S. or even some like Western Atlantic moisture. When they come down like that, I can tell you right now, there's not a lot of moisture here in this part of the world. In fact, Eric just showed you yesterday, we have a lack of snowpack here from some of the warmth that we've built in at the end of December and early January here. I'm going to play this out through the weekend as we go through Friday and Saturday. Just more of the same. That trough reinforcing itself here over the Midwest, kind of positioned right now on Saturday over Chicago, and that ridge amplifying all the way up into Alaska, kind of allowing this pattern to do something like that as we go through the forecast period. Playing it forward into next Monday. Boy, just not a huge change. I mean, this is almost, taking it out to the January 22nd at this point, getting to the point where we're at 10 days, and we don't start to see kind of a change until about there, all the way Friday, January 23rd. So right about at 10 days, way at the end of next week. And the change that we're seeing, remember that ridge that was here? I mean, started the video talking about that high over Colorado, the ridge just down or upstream of it. It's common kind of signature. Well, that ridge is pushing. It's amplified itself all the way kind of up into Alaska and even further west to that. And that's allowed that trough to retrograde right along with it. So instead of that troughing positioned here in 10 days, it's positioned more so here. If I play this forecast forward to the 24th, I actually see a ridge starting to build up here across the Atlantic coast. And now that troughing is moving more so into the middle part of the country, if not anchored even a little bit west. And I mentioned just a second ago that kind of trajectory of those troughs matters. So now we have that flow that's going to allow some better Gulf moisture to push in, I think, to the eastern part of the country. Let's draw it together. Right, that 500 millibar flow here, probably going to have some sort of downstream low pressure system associated with that. Well, the winds at the surface flow counterclockwise around those like that. And if you just kind of follow these arrows with me at the surface, we're starting to pull some moisture back up into the middle part of the country, at least the southeast, I would think, as we get out toward that last week of January here. Now, let's put this all together with the ECMWF, just the precipitation forecast here. Play this one through this evening. And to midnight tonight, that low stretching across eastern Canada. Just some light showers here through the interior. A little bit of consolidation along that cold front that I mentioned here as we go through the day. Wednesday, some light snow showers behind that. We saw those, right, those little lake effect advisories for snow on the back side of the system. This isn't going to be a big rainfall, unfortunately, for the east and southeast who kind of need it here. But as this wraps up a little bit here on Wednesday and Thursday, this trough amplifying now. Some better snowfall values over kind of the upstate region of New England and some of the elevation there, not really impacting the metro east. Thursday, in other words, trough system dips down and then in through Friday during lunchtime. But again, deep low pressure system here across the Great Lakes, but not a lot of snow with it. Kind of broad, widespread, cold, snowy showers. But these aren't the kind that are going to like heavily accumulate a lot of snow, causing travel disruptions outside of like the Great Lake kind of lake effect snow corridor. These are more just kind of these snow squalls that can bring a dusting, if not an inch or two of snow. That whips through quickly through the Midwest by this weekend. Positions out into the eastern Corn Belt, Ohio River Valley in New England, and we have another one of these come through on Sunday and Monday. And temperatures just kind of coming down across the west all the while. Now, as we go further into next week, remember the Friday the 24th, we're at Wednesday now, we started to see that trough, which was here, retrograde further to the west. That's allowing a little bit better flow to come into the southeast. So even by the end of the ECMWF forecast period, this is now Thursday out at the end of the period, we're seeing better rainfall potential across the southeast. And I would think if that trough continues to push further west, you're seeing some snow now return to Wyoming, that you would see that rainfall probabilities here start to pick up somewhere in that corridor here, maybe even a little bit further north if the trough can continue to amplify. That's 10 days plus out in the forecast, right? So kind of reaching at the end of our forecast confidence, but that's definitely the signature you're seeing pop up. As anytime we have a big high, I mentioned that low pressure system over Ontario, you got to watch wind gusts in between the two. And seeing some winds here this morning across the high plains, nothing too substantial. Those shift as that low comes through across the upper Midwest through like Ohio and Michigan here today and tomorrow. Again, nothing too strong, but as that second piece comes down out of Canada going through Thursday, watching closely here for like western Nebraska, the Black Hills, eastern Wyoming, portions of Montana here. Got a corridor getting up a little bit closer to that damaging threshold. So looking at like Thursday, let's look a little bit closer. Yeah, that looks like Thursday night, maybe Friday AM. Of a corridor of strong winds. That's about it as far as winds go through the forecast period there. Took that out just about 7 days or beyond. If we sum this up, Eric showed this yesterday. I mean, that flow region out of the north, sure, relative to average, this area looking above average for precipitation just with respect to snowfall here over the upper Midwest, but that's about it. Only kind of the Gulf Coast here with that system late next week popped up on the map. Otherwise, largely below average across a wide area of the country, even well up into like British Columbia as that ridge further amplifies there. So the lack of rainfall, certainly across the southern kind of third, if not the southern 2/3 of the country, now starting to become something of a problem. We've mentioned the concerns with snowpack out west, especially with the snowmelt occurring now. And we're going to have to keep an eye on this. If you look at the USDA drought monitor here this winter, this was updated on the 6th. We'll get another update here in 2 days. They're analyzing it here today. The drought area of the country, it's still pretty wide. I mean, there's a lot of areas in some sort of drought. Curiously enough, not California at all. So much of this decade, California has been in some form of drought. And I'll have to look up when the last time California didn't have any drought in it. That's maybe a first in quite a while, maybe even like this decade plus, because I can't remember a time when there wasn't like something, some color patch over it, maybe even abnormally dry, but I don't even see that. I think it's totally clear. But this area, this winter, has slowly turned in the wrong direction just with the lack of rainfall. And we track this with these kind of time series charts. So I started this fittingly right at January in 2020, so start of this decade. And we saw, because of that triple dip La Niña to start out, so many of so much of the country in some form of drought, almost up near like 50% at times. That fell. We had that, remember that El Nino episode in 23 and 24, and then back into La Nina. And we're seeing that here with that kind of recent spike in those drought signatures. But if you look closely, just over the last few weeks, technically our drought area is expanding again here at the end of winter. So I want to keep an eye on this with that lack of rainfall, not only just in the last 30 to 60 days, but now in the forecast, we're seeing this drought area expand a bit heading into the new year. With the kind of what it looks like the eve of El Nino, I would think that's going to reverse itself at some point here this year. But, those hypotheticals are just that, just hypotheticals. We typically put more weight onto where the trend is right now, at least with respect to drought. It's in the expanding direction right now. I did mention I want to look at minimum temperatures before I go too far into the long range. I'm going to do this quickly. Just want to look at those cold overnight lows Thursday morning, getting down into the teens and the 20s across the Mid-South. Colder mornings coming there for like Arkansas through Tennessee. Take that into Friday, and that shifts across the Gulf Coast. Man, down to 27 Fahrenheit, Jacksonville, 24 in Tallahassee. Would expect to see quite a few of those cold weather advisories pop up in that corridor there that we watch every year around this time. Saturday, more of that continuing, a little bit of a warm up on the backside here. That comes crashing down again on Sunday. I mentioned there's going to be these kind of cold fronts that swing through. The temperatures will be moderating a little bit at times, but then just coming right back down into like the negatives up in Minnesota by Sunday. Some playoff games being played in Chicago, right? 7 degrees Fahrenheit, the low Sunday morning, probably back down to that overnight as we go toward Monday morning. Yep. And just much colder across the eastern U.S. as a result of that trough settling in early next week. Now, I mentioned earlier, the further we go out into the forecast, like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, that's out into next week. I took this all the way out into next week, and you're starting to see that trough move a little bit west. That's allowing some ridging to build up in the southeast. So temperatures warming up here, Gulf moisture returning, expecting a corridor of precipitation to increase as a result of that near the end of next week. We can see that just with the temperature anomaly cards. So here's all three models, ensemble ECMWF, ensemble GFS, and the AIFS. And I'm just going to kind of skip ahead to the middle part of the country, seeing that troughing amplify here. And as a result, I'm just kind of drawing where I think that trough location is going to be. And you get better southwest flow over some of these areas here, likely to pick back up the moisture, including the warmth. Look at the warmth here forecast by the ensembles across the southern tier of the country here. That's going over so cold in a lot of the areas of the southeast. So relief coming in terms of temperatures for those areas here. Not a lot of relief for this corridor here. That's kind of been stuck in the cold here through the 10 to 15 day forecast period. So that's the pattern I'll be keeping an eye on as we go through this weekend and next. As a result of that, if you look at both those ensembles, wet across the Ohio Valley, portions of it, and the southern Mississippi Valley, that's an area that's been very dry over the last 60 days. The GFS, even bullish across much of the Midwest and New England. This would probably be interesting for a snow story somewhere in this corridor here. Obviously, that rain-snow line often kind of hugging I-80 and north of there. I'll have to keep an eye on that. But certainly more interesting in the way of precipitation, that trend picking up as we go through the forecast period here. Unfortunately, for California, not seeing a coincident pickup in the precipitation there. It seems to be largely more so this corridor here. Eric did a good job explaining what's going on in the MJO. I'll just kind of piggyback on that really quick. As we're seeing the MJO and that westerly wind burst move through the Central Pacific on the kind of terminus or the eastern edge of that western wind burst, we see convergence with the kind of previous easterly anomalies. And so as you'd imagine, if that westerly wind burst gets all the way out into the Central Pacific, kind of on the nose of it, we'd expect convergence and thunderstorms. And that's way over here in like phase 8, near like January 28th. So that's why you're seeing this very quick transit by the 28th of January. That's this little dot right there. The MJO moving all the way into phase 8 and even maybe 1 or 2 after that. So that has Eric and I looking out further into February thinking like, okay, what are those kind of phase 8, 1, 2, and 3 phases looking like as we go later into February? Because we saw that at least through like January 28th, we have a good handle on where that trough's going to be. But if I look through like the early January phases, let's do phase 8 first. I do think we'll be out of that by early February. If we were to kind of stay in that, we'd probably stay in a pattern that looks similar to where we are in the forecast with like ridging west and cooler east. But really, I think by then, we're looking at somewhere like phase 1, 2, maybe even 3 as we get out into February. So like that's more so where I wanted to look. And if we look into like phase 2, that's a colder pattern for the U.S. But if we look into phase 3, that actually shifts colder, I think, for the West And even if we tried to get like phase 4, colder for the west, we start to warm up a little bit back here over in the eastern U.S. So, but really kind of looking at phase 2 and 3 in February, I see better support for cold air if we end up all the way over in some of those phases. Now, if we swing really quickly through what might be a Kelvin wave here, and we come right back over, early to mid-February in phase 5 and 6, well, those actually in February are warmer for the eastern U.S., maybe a little bit cooler for the western U.S. So we'll just have to see how quickly that kind of MJO swings around. More often than not, most of those phases show kind of a colder pattern for February. Eric mentioned in the weeklies that potential in early February for a warm-up in temperatures. Let's see if I can identify that here on the latest model run. Yeah, there's that warm-up kind of early February, and then colder weather returning there after that, kind of mid to late February. It wouldn't surprise me if that's a scenario that we do see play out. Now, if I take this forecast further out, surprisingly seeing a lot of this cold signature in the west. So if we go back to like the global, looking at where those thunderstorms might be on the ECMWF weeklies, and I take this all the way out into like mid-February, we're seeing a lot of those MJO phases pick up in the Indian Ocean. That's like maybe phase 2, 3, and 4, and some of those were, a little bit cooler for the western U.S. So might be seeing the ECMWF weeklies pick up on a little bit of that. That's what we're watching. Really kind of our eyes are over here. Not only the Australian heat wave, but the MJO that's been positioned kind of in this corridor here, and that westerly wind burst on its way out to the central Pacific. That might be the death knell for La Niña, and it might be El Niño 2026 waking up for the first time. We'll keep an eye on that. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow, and I'll talk with you all again soon. Thanks for watching.